Okay, let's unpack this. We're diving into a chapter of World War II that's complex, often overshadowed, but absolutely vital. The Italian campaign, sometimes called the liberation of Italy.
And this was no quick fight. I mean, it was a long, brutal effort, really stretched from the summer of 43 right up to the very end, spring of 45.
Yeah, a real slog.
Yeah.
We've got sources here laying out the whole story, Allied and Axis operations across Italy, from the initial landings right up to the final surrender.
So our mission in this deep dive is, well, to pull out the key events, understand the strategic thinking and the disagreements, which were pretty major behind it all.
Right, and explore the incredible challenges faced by everyone involved and the significant human cost. We want to help you get a clear, well-informed picture of this vital front.
Absolutely, because
Right.
it really was vital.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting right at the start. Before a single Allied soldier even landed in Italy proper, there was this major strategic argument happening at the top. What were the two main camps here?
Well, you had the British, particularly Churchill, really pushing for what they called a peripheral strategy,
Peripheral, meaning.
meaning using their naval power, hitting the enemy on the edges, the soft underbelly, as Churchill famously put it, to sort of gradually wear them down before trying a big direct assault.
Okay, that's one view.
And the other, that was the United States. They had this massive, rapidly growing army, and the U.S. leadership, well, they wanted a much more direct approach.
Go straight for the main German forces.
Exactly. Confront them head-on in northwestern Europe as soon as possible. For the Americans, the priority was clear. Nothing should significantly delay a full-scale invasion of France across the Channel. Operation Overlord was the main event for them.
So, a real tension there. How did they resolve it?
Well, like a lot of things in coalition warfare,
Hmm.
they compromised. The big decision was, yes, commit the bulk of Allied forces to invade France in early 1944.
Uh,
But, as our sources show, they also agreed to launch what was initially thought of as a relatively small-scale campaign in Italy during 1943.
why Italy specifically? What was the thinking there, according to the sources?
Several factors, really. President Roosevelt wanted American troops actively fighting Germans in Europe in 1943. The Soviets were screaming for a second front.
And Italy looked like a target.
Yeah, it seemed like an achievable goal, knocking Italy, one of the main Axis powers, out of the war.
And that had some potentially big knock-on effects, right?
Absolutely. The hope was take Italy out, and suddenly the Allies have much more control over the Mediterranean Sea.
Which helps with supply lines.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Securing those crucial routes to places like Egypt, the Middle East, even towards Asia. Plus, the idea was it would force Germany and Italy initially to pull troops away from the Eastern Front.
Helping the Soviets.
Right, and maybe pull forces from other areas too. So it was seen as a way to contribute to the overall war effort, even if it wasn't the main thrust for the Americans.
Okay, so the decision's made. The first act in this whole drama begins across the water on Sicily, Operation Husky. When did that kick off?
That was July 9th, 1943. And it was a huge operation. You had both amphibious landings straight from the sea and significant airborne drops behind the lines.
And the ground forces were a mix too, you said.
Oh, yeah. The U.S. 7th Army, the British 8th Army, and Canadian forces, too, all working together or trying to.
Was the plan always concentrated landings?
Actually, no. The initial plan was apparently for more widespread landings around the island, but they changed it, concentrated the forces on fewer beaches. More punch that way.
And the roles were initially pretty distinct.
Yeah, the Brits were supposed to push north along the east coast, aiming for Messina, that vital port. Canadians took the center, tough, mountainous country.
And the Americans.
The U.S. 7th Army was on the left flank. Their job was basically to clear the western part of the island and, help push the Axis forces off Sicily entirely.
But I read the British advance on the East Coast hit some really tough defenses. That changed things.
It did. It meant the U.S. mission expanded dramatically. When Montgomery's 8th Army got bogged down near Catania, the Americans under Patton pivoted.
How so?
They pushed rapidly northwest, grabbed Palermo surprisingly fast, and swung north to cut the coastal road, and finally drove east along that road towards Messina. A real flanking maneuver.
And the sources also mentioned the Canadians in the middle having a rough time.
They really did. Incredibly brutal fighting, driving experienced German paratroopers out of rugged high ground. The Canadian War Cemetery in Agira, mentioned in the sources, is a testament to just how heavy that fighting was.
So the Allies took Sicily relatively quickly by mid-August 43, but was it a total victory in terms of trapping the enemy?
Well, yes and no. They took the island, which was huge. But our sources point out that despite the Allied success by August 17th, most of the German and Italian troops actually managed a successful evacuation.
Across the Strait of Messina
Yeah,
to the mainland.
exactly, before the Allies could completely close the trap. So a lot of experienced enemy soldiers got away to fight another day.
Okay, so looking back at Sicily, what were the big takeaways for the Allies from this first phase? What did they learn?
Oh, it was an invaluable experience. Their first really big opposed amphibious operation since North Africa.
Yeah.
The first major airborne assault like this.
And working together, coalition stuff.
Crucial learning curve there, too. Getting different national armies, different commanders to coordinate effectively. It really laid the groundwork for, well, for D-Day and everything else.
And everything else in Italy came quickly. Just weeks after Sicily fell, the Allies jumped straight to the mainland.
That's right. Monty's British Eighth Army went first. Landed in the toe of Italy, Calabria, on September 3rd, 1943. Operation Baytown.
And something absolutely huge happened on that exact same day, didn't it, politically?
Yes, a massive turning point. Unknown to most of the soldiers hitting the beaches, the Italian government under Marshal Badoglio had secretly agreed to an armistice with the Allies.
Wow. And when was that made public?
Just a few days later, September 8th. Suddenly, Italy wasn't allied with Germany anymore.
How did the Germans react? I imagine that caused chaos.
Total chaos. But the Germans in Italy, under Kesselring, had kind of anticipated this. They were prepared. They immediately launched Operation Oxy.
Which was?
It basically disarmed the Italian Royal Army units. Any Italian soldiers who didn't cooperate or who resisted. Well, the Germans dealt with them brutally. They effectively occupied northern and central Italy almost overnight.
And the sources document some horrific actions during this German takeover.
They do. German forces committed numerous atrocities against Italian soldiers who resisted and against civilians, too. This really fueled the beginnings of the Italian resistance movement against the German occupation.
And meanwhile, Mussolini, he'd been arrested after being deposed back in July. What happened to him?
He got rescued. German commandos, led by Otto Skorzeny, pulled off this daring glider raid and freed him from his mountain prison.
And then what?
The Germans then set him up as the head of a puppet state in the German-occupied north, the Italian Social Republic, the RSI, based around Salo.
So you basically ended up with two Italys at this point, fighting each other.
Precisely. Because on October 13th, 1943, the Allies formally recognized the anti-fascist Italian government in the South, the Kingdom of the South, as a co-belligerent.
Meaning they were fighting with the Allies.
Yes, against Germany and Mussolini's RSI.
Ugh.
So you had units of the new Italian co-belligerent army,
Right.
plus growing numbers of Italian partisans fighting alongside Allied troops against German forces and Italian fascist units. The sources definitely describe aspects of an Italian civil war.
While the British landed in the tow, Operation Baytown, other Allied landings were happening too, right?
Yes, most significantly, the U.S. Fifth Army under General Mark Clark landed near Salerno, south of Naples. That was Operation Avalanche, starting September 9th.
And they had a tougher time.
Incredibly tough. They faced very heavy, determined German resistance right on the beaches and inland. It was touch and go for a while there.
Contrast that with another British landing further south.
Yeah, Operation Slapstick. British forces landed at Taranto, inside the heel of Italy, almost unopposed. The Germans just weren't there in strength. Shows how stretched the Germans were initially.
There was maybe some initial hope the Germans might just pull back north, towards the Alps. But that didn't happen.
No. Apparently Hitler was tempted to do just that. But Field Marshal Kesselring, the German commander in Italy, argued strongly against it.
Why? What was his reasoning?
He convinced Hitler that Italy's geography, all those mountains and rivers, offered superb defensive terrain. They could make the Allies fight for every inch.
And there was another strategic reason, too.
Yes, crucially, defending Italy would prevent the Allies from using it as a springboard for an invasion into the Balkans. Germany needed resources from there, oil from Romania, bauxite, copper. Couldn't risk losing that.
So the decision was made, dig in and fight.
Exactly. Fight for the peninsula.
And that terrain you mentioned, the sources really emphasize how brutal it was for the attackers.
Oh, absolutely. As the Allies started pushing north from Salerno and Taranto, they ran straight into the spine of Italy, the Apennine Mountains.
It's not just gentle hills.
No way. We're talking peaks over 3,000 feet, endless steep ridges, deep river valleys that ran across the line of advance, plus the weather. Rain, mud, snow in winter, unexpected floods. It was just a defender's paradise.
And Kesselring planned to use it.
He did. He ordered the construction of a whole series of defensive lines, one after another, running across the peninsula south of Rome.
What was the strategy there? Just delay.
Sort of. Lines like the Volturno Line and the Barba Line were mainly delaying positions. Buy time, inflict casualties, make the Allies pay, while the Germans built their main masterpiece,
The Winter Line.
the Winter Line. It's a really formidable system. Its main component was the Gustav Line, anchored on Monte Cassino in the west. Then you had associated lines like the Bernhardt Line and the Hitler Line, later renamed the Singer Line.
And these lines worked. They stopped the Allies.
For a long time, yes. The Winter Line basically halted the U.S. Fifth Army's advance on the western side through the winter of 43-44.
What about on the Adriatic coast? The British Eighth Army.
They managed to break through parts of the Gustav Line over there. And the Canadians fought that incredibly savage battle for Wotona, house-to-house fighting, finally taking it just after Christmas 43. But then, yeah, blizzards hit. The winter weather just shut down major operations.
So, with the main lines holding firm, where did Allied attention turn next?
Back to the Western Front, really. Specifically the Liri Valley. It runs north from Cassino towards Rome. It was seen as, well, maybe the best or least bad route to the capital.
And this brings us to a really famous and controversial part of the campaign, the Anzio landings. Operation Shingle. What was the idea behind that?
The idea, heavily pushed by Churchill again, was to land troops amphibiously behind the Gustav Line, near Anzio and Nettuno, just south of Rome.
To outflank the Germans.
Exactly. The hope was it would force the Germans to pull troops away from the Gustav Line to deal with the landing, destabilize their whole defense, and, open the road to Rome.
But it didn't quite pan out that way, did it? What went wrong?
Well, there were command disagreements. And the American general on the ground, Major General John P. Lucas, was very cautious after the landing.
Instead of pushing inland quickly?
Right. Instead of exploiting the initial surprise and pushing for the Alban Hills, which overlooked the German supply routes to the Gustav Line, he focused on digging in, consolidating the beachhead. He worried about getting cut off.
And Kesselring's reaction?
Swift and decisive. He reacted incredibly quickly, rushed German reserves from all over, even from France and the Balkans, and completely sealed off the beachhead.
So Anzio turned into another stalemate.
Pretty much a static, bloody slugging match. Instead of breaking the deadlock at Cassino, Anzio became its own isolated battle. It took over 4 months of really hard fighting before the forces there could finally break out in late May 44.
And breaking the main winter line itself, the Gustav Line around Cassino, that required a huge effort too.
A massive effort. It wasn't finally broken until May 1944. It took 4 major offensives between January and May. A huge combined assault.
Who was involved?
The U.S. Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army, side by side. But within those armies, you had troops from everywhere. British, American, French colonial troops, particularly the Moroccans, who were fierce mountain fighters. Polish troops, who made the final assault on Monte Cassino itself. Canadians, New Zealanders, Indians. A truly multinational force hammering away at those defenses.
Now, something fascinating happened right as the Gustav Line was finally broken. A chance to trap the Germans.
Yes. As the German 10th Army started pulling back from Cassino, there was a potential opportunity to cut them off in the Liri Valley, trap a large part of their force. Orders were apparently given to the forces breaking out from Anzio to link up with the main advance and close the trap.
But the American commander, General Mark Clark, made a different call. What did he do?
Well, the sources document this controversial decision. Clark apparently disobeyed orders to prioritize cutting off the German retreat. Instead, he directed his troops, the U.S. Vice Corps, breaking out from Anzio straight towards Rome.
Which the Germans weren't defending?
Right. The Germans had declared Rome an open city to try and spare it from destruction. So American forces entered Rome essentially unopposed on June 4th, 1944.
A big symbolic victory. First Axis capital to fall.
Huge symbolically. Great headlines back home.
But what was the consequence of letting the German 10th Army escape, according to our sources?
The critical consequence noted is that this large, experienced German force got away pretty much intact. They were able to pull back, regroup, and form the next defensive line further north. The sources suggest this missed opportunity might have significantly prolonged the Italian campaign and certainly increased Allied casualties in the months that followed. They had to keep fighting those same tough German units all the way up the boot.
So Rome is captured June 4th, 1944. Big moment.
Oh.
But the campaign is far from over. And just 2 days later, boom, something massive happens elsewhere.
D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Normandy landings. And that immediately had a huge impact on the Italian front.
How so? Resources diverted?
Big time. With the main Allied effort now focused squarely on Northwest Europe, Italy became, well, even more of a secondary theater in the eyes of the top Allied planners, especially the Americans. Experienced units started getting pulled out.
Like who?
Over that summer of 44, the U.S. V Corps, the guys who took Rome, and the highly effective French Expeditionary Corps, with its mountain troops, were withdrawn. That's 7 divisions in total.
Where did they go?
They were needed for Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France in August 44.
That must seriously weaken the Allied punch in Italy, right when they were trying to push north from Rome?
Oh, definitely. It took time to replace those veteran divisions. New formations did arrive eventually, later in 44 and into 45.
Like the Brazilians.
Yes, the Brazilian 1st Infantry Division arrived. Also, the segregated U.S. 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, and the U.S. 10th Mountain Division, specifically trained for mountain warfare, which is obviously useful in Italy.
So, as the depleted Allied forces moved north from Rome, they took Florence and then hit the next big German defense line.
The Gothic Line. This was Kesselring's last major prepared defensive system. It stretched right across the narrowest part of northern Italy through the rugged northern Apennines, coast to coast.
And the Allies launched a big offensive against it, Operation Olive, starting late August 44.
They did. And they did manage to penetrate the Gothic Line in several places, particularly on the Adriatic side. But despite really heavy fighting through the autumn,
No decisive breakthrough?
no, they couldn't achieve that knockout blow that would collapse the German defenses entirely. The Germans fought tenaciously, the terrain was still awful, and the weather turned bad again.
I saw the sources mention Churchill still had bigger ideas for Italy, even at this late stage.
He did, even as the front bogged down at the Gothic Line in late 44. Churchill was apparently still pushing for a major Allied drive northeast out of Italy through the Ljubljana Gap towards Vienna and the Danube.
Why? To beat the Soviets there?
Partly, yeah. Maybe to influence the post-war map of Europe. But the American military leadership strongly opposed it. They saw it as a dangerous diversion from the main effort against Germany in the West, and it just didn't fit the overall agreed Allied strategy. So it didn't happen.
So the front basically solidified again through the winter of 44-45, another winter stalemate.
Largely, yes. The awful weather returned. Allied losses had been heavy in the autumn fighting, troop morale wasn't great, and units were still being shuffled around. So the main Allied offensive ground to a halt. They adopted a strategy described as offensive defense.
Meaning?
Holding the line, launching limited attacks to keep pressure on, building up strength, improving supply lines, and basically preparing for one last big push when spring arrives in 1945.
And while the main armies were relatively static, what was happening behind German lines in northern Italy?
Intense activity. Partisan warfare was incredibly widespread by this point. That Italian Civil War aspect we mentioned really ramped up. Partisans controlled large areas of the countryside, ambushed German convoys, gathered intelligence for the Allies, and tied down significant numbers of German and RSI troops.
When did that final Allied offensive finally kick off?
April 1945.
Yeah.
It started with absolutely massive air and artillery bombardments all along the front, just overwhelming firepower.
And by this point, the Allies had a huge numerical advantage.
Huge. The sources estimate something like 1.5 million Allied personnel in the theater, though not all frontline troops, of course, against maybe 600,000 Axis troops, many of whom were RSI Italians or lower-quality German units by this stage.
Then the breakthroughs came quickly this time.
Very quickly. The British 8th Army broke through on the eastern flank near the Adriatic and executed this brilliant, rapid encircling move. They linked up with the U.S. IV Corps, which had broken out of the Apennines further west.
Trapping who?
They trapped the main German forces defending Bologna. The city was entered by Polish troops of the 8th Army and Italian partisans on April 21st.
And from there, the advance just snowballed.
Pretty much. Allied columns raced north, reaching and crossing the vital Po River Valley with surprising speed. The German defense just started to collapse.
And the Italian partisans played a big role in these final days, too.
Absolutely. They launched a general uprising across northern Italy on April 25th, which is still celebrated as a Liberation Day in Italy. They seized control of cities like Milan, Genoa, Turin, often before Allied troops arrived, harassing retreating Germans, capturing fascist officials.
Where were the main Allied forces pushing towards?
They fanned out, pushing north towards Venice and Trieste on the Adriatic side, heading up towards the Austrian border via the Brenner Pass, and west towards Milan and Turin. The U.S. 92nd Division advanced up the Ligurian coast towards Genoa.
Any particular actions stand out in these final chaotic moments?
Well, the sources highlight the very rapid advance of the Brazilian division towards Turin. Apparently, their speed completely surprised the German-Italian army in Liguria in that sector and caused its collapse.
And there were some specific battles mentioned near the end.
Yes, the battles of Collecchio Fornovo di Taro. between April 26th and May 1st. These are noted as particularly significant.
Why those?
That's where the German 148th Infantry Division ended up surrendering en masse to the Brazilians. They captured something like 15,000 Axis troops there, Germans and Italians. The sources mark this as effectively the end of Mussolini's RSI army as a fighting force.
So by the very end of April 1945, the writing was clearly on the wall for the Germans in Italy.
Completely. Army Group C was disintegrating, retreating everywhere, having lost most of its heavy equipment and cohesion. The German commander, General von Wiedinghoff-Kesselring, had been moved to the Western Front, but then saw it was hopeless.
And he surrendered.
He authorized his representatives to sign the surrender document at Caserta on April 29th. That formally ended all hostilities in Italy, effective May 2nd, 1945. Just a few days before the final German surrender ended the war in Europe entirely. Mussolini's Minister of Defense also ordered his remaining RSI units to lay down their arms on May 1st.
So the end of a very long, very hard road.
A very long road. And if we connect this all back to the bigger picture, this whole campaign, this nearly two-year push up the peninsula, came at an absolutely staggering cost.
Yeah, the sources are really stark on this. Italy was, in fact, the most costly campaign on the entire Western Front, meaning Italy, France, Belgium, etc., in terms of infantry casualties, for both sides.
And get this, the sources even state that the casualty rate among infantry soldiers fighting in Italy, particularly around those strong defensive lines like Cassino or the Gothic Line, was proportionally higher than on the Western Front of World War I.
Wow. Higher than World War I trench warfare. That's sobering.
It really gives you a sense of the brutal, close-quarters nature of the fighting in that terrain.
So what were the overall casualty numbers looking like for the Allies?
Total Allied casualties killed, wounded, missing, prisoners for the whole campaign from Sicily onwards are estimated somewhere between about 358,000 and 376,000.
And for the Axis, Germany and the RSI?
Significantly higher overall, though the numbers are maybe less precise. Estimates range from 1.5 million to maybe 1.8 million total casualties.
But a huge chunk of that is prisoners at the end.
Exactly. That figure includes the massive surrender of maybe 1 million men from Army Group C right at the very end in May 45.
Okay, what about just soldiers killed? Do we have estimates for that?
Estimates vary quite a bit here. For the period from the mainland invasion in September 43 to April 45, Allied killed are estimated around 60,000 to 70,000. German killed in that same period, estimates range widely from maybe 38,000 up to 150,000.
That's a big range.
It is. Total German military deaths in Italy, including Sicily, are often estimated at around 150,000.
And the Italians, before the armistice.
Fascist Italy suffered about 200,000 casualties before September 43, but most of those were prisoners taken during the invasion of Sicily.
And the cost wasn't just soldiers. The civilian population suffered immensely.
Terribly.
Yeah.
The sources state over 150,000 Italian civilians died during the campaign. Bombing, crossfire, massacres, and then you have the casualties from the internal conflict.
The partisans and the RSI troops?
Yes. Estimates suggest around 35,000 anti-Nazi, anti-fascist partisans were killed, and maybe a similar number, around 35,000, troops fighting for Mussolini's Italian Social Republic died as well. A truly devastating conflict for Italy itself.
And beyond the immense human cost, the material losses, planes, tanks, must have been huge too.
Thousands of aircraft and armored vehicles destroyed or lost by both sides over those nearly 2 years of constant fighting. It just consumed resources.
This brings us to a difficult but important point mentioned in the source material, the issue of war crimes.
Yes, the sources are clear that atrocities were committed during this conflict and that personnel from both sides were involved.
What do the sources say about Axis crimes?
Well, reporting on the Axis side, specific research funded by the German government itself, published in 2016, documented approximately 22,000 victims of Nazi war crimes in Italy. This is primarily Italian civilians and also Italian Jews who were deported or killed.
And the scale of some of these incidents.
It's horrifying. The documentation found over 14,000 non-Jewish civilians were killed in thousands of separate incidents, over 5,300 documented cases. Often these were brutal reprisals for partisan attacks.
The sources list some specific examples.
They do. Infamous ones like the Marzabotto massacre, where over 770 civilians were murdered near Bologna, Sant'Anna di Stazzema, 560 killed, mostly women and children. The Ardeatine massacre in Rome, 335 randomly selected hostages, including 75 Jews, executed in caves as retaliation for a partisan bomb, and the Padula di Fucecchio massacre of 284 civilians executed. Just brutal.
The sources also report instances of war crimes committed by Allied personnel.
Yes, it's important to note the sources document these too. There are reports of killings of civilians by Allied soldiers, like the Canicotti massacre mentioned in Sicily. There are documented cases of the summary execution of prisoners, such as the two separate massacres at Biscari airfield, also during the Sicily campaign.
And other types of crimes.
The sources also reference instances of rape committed by Allied troops. The most notorious are often referred to collectively as the Moroccanate, primarily involving French colonial troops after the breakthrough at Cassino, though other Allied troops were implicated in crimes elsewhere too.
It's crucial, as you say, to report what the documentation presents impartially. These atrocities from both sides were part of the grim reality of this campaign.
Absolutely. Acknowledging it is essential to understanding the full picture.
So wrapping this up,
Mhm.
what does it all mean? We've taken this deep dive into the Italian campaign. We started with those big strategic debates among the Allies.
Yeah, the whole peripheral strategy versus direct assault argument.
Then the landings in Sicily, crucial experience gained there. And then the jump to the mainland, complicated immediately by Italy switching sides.
Right, leading to the German occupation, the rise of the resistance, Mussolini's puppet state.
Yeah.
That whole messy internal conflict layered on top of the Allied-German war.
We explored those incredibly tough geographic challenges. The mountains, the rivers, the weather, making it a defender's dream.
And the attacker's nightmare, leading to that slow, grueling, costly fight up the peninsula.
We looked at the struggle against those formidable German defensive lines, the Winter Line, Monte Cassino, the Gothic Line, the huge multinational Allied effort it took to break them.
And those controversial moments, like Anzio, or the decision to prioritize taking Rome over potentially trapping the German 10th Army.
And finally, we confronted that immense human cost. The staggering military casualties, especially for the infantry, proportionally higher than even the First World War's Western Front, according to the sources.
Plus the tragic deaths of over 150,000 Italian civilians and the tens of thousands killed in the internal Italian conflict, and those documented war crimes on both sides.
It's clear from everything we've looked at. While Italy might not always get the spotlight, like Normandy or the Eastern Front, it was an absolutely vital, incredibly complex, and tragically costly part of the Second World War.
Definitely. No quick sideshow, that's for sure.
So here's a final thought for you, our listener, to consider. Given those initial deep strategic disagreements we talked about, given the brutal effectiveness of Italy's geography for defense, and given the complex, shifting internal situation within Italy itself, was the Italian campaign, with its undeniable strategic benefits, but also its immense cost in lives and resources, truly the necessary or perhaps the most effective path the Allies could have taken? Or could those resources have potentially been better used, say, concentrating everything even earlier for the push across France? Something to mull over.